Hello, everyone. Yeah, do you hear me? Okay. Wow. So happy to see you all here. Thank you for coming. My name is Mikołaj, and I mostly work as a designer, but I also do some front-end work. And yes, on a daily basis, I'm leading a design team of 6, but like on a technical side, I mostly focus on stuff such as UI development, CSS, and SVG. Cool, so we are here today apparently to talk about design tokens. And first of all, I would like to ask you a question. Could you please put your hand up if you ever heard about design tokens before, like, coming to this conference and seeing the title of this talk? Okay, and now can you please keep your hand up? Keep your hand up. Yeah. Can you please keep your hand up if you ever used design tokens in your daily work? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, my point is that design tokens are a concept that is going increasingly popular in our industry, but its real adoption, especially in production environments and real projects, is still very, very low. And before we start the real presentation, I'd like to tell you a quick story. And it's a story of a little orange color. And the little orange color was invented by a designer who created this specific hue of orange to be used for, warning messages in their project. And first of all, it was just in one place, but then the project developed, and it was used not only for the warning background, but also for the warning border and warning text, eventually some warning background again. Yeah, and so the time passed. And it was used in iOS application and in Android application and on different web environments. And at some point, another designer joined the project, and they started to draw illustrations. And yeah, they needed some hue of orange, so we already have an orange on the project, so why don't we use the one we already have? And yeah, they started to use the same orange for icons and visual stuff that had nothing to do with warning messages. Yeah, and here's the tweak in the story, because now the villain comes, and the villain is a vicious designer who joins the project and changes the hue of orange. But they doesn't change the hue of orange in all the places, but they change the hue of orange only in some of the cases. For example, just making the orange text a bit darker for the better contrast, and the accessibility, or just the borders. And this really confused the developers, because the developers had literally no idea what orange is to change now. There was some variable in SAS, but this variable was not necessarily just for warning messages. There was some variable in Java and in Swift, but again, some of the colors were just hex, some were these variables. There was more of those variables. Yeah, and that was the point when the team started to use design tokens. So what those design tokens actually are? Well, if you search on the web, you will find quite a lot of definitions for design tokens. Actually, most of them being contrary with each other. But one of the most popular ones, created by Salesforce, who is, I think, currently one of the main advocates behind this idea, says that design tokens are an agnostic way to store variables, such as typography, spacing, so that your design system can be shared across platforms like iOS, Android, web. Okay. And I'm sharing this one with you not because it's the very best one or the most correct, but maybe to prove you just the opposite. And usually in technical talks, I think we kind of do the theory first and then go to examples and demos. But this time, let me please do this a bit the other way around. So I will show you a quick example of how design tokens work in real life, and then we'll get back to the theory. And to do so, I will probably have to show you my screen. Nope, like that. Wow, okay, now it works. Cool. So this is probably one of the smallest projects you've ever seen. This is a single HTML page, my personal website. Like single page, like a few headings and a few unordered lists in one file. And that's basically it. And the design for this page was created in Figma. Here we go, that's a popular UI design tool. And what's funny about the way this project is implemented is that if I decide to make some changes to those designs and let's say change my style of the background color to some beautiful electric blue and then change the primary color to what would be the nice fit. Maybe some green, yeah. If now I go to the code and run my build command, where we are, here we go. Actually, this will be just a part of the build to make it quicker. What you should see on a screen is that the whole project instantly gets updated. And this is not only about the colors. Also, if you check the grid of this page, I think it's kind of visible. You have to believe me, it's there. It's based like on a set of components, they name spacers, and yeah, those spacers are the base of the grid, and I can just go to my style guide page and decide that I want those spacings to be smaller and change my spacing from 75 to, let's say, 25 pixels. And now if I go and run the build command again, the whole layout of the page will instantly get much more condensed. Okay, so let's try to figure out now what's happening under the hood. Let's get back to the presentation. Here we are. Okay, so this page is built on the, using a static site generator called 11t that, by the way, Chris was already talking about before. And surprise, surprise, it's also using a continuous deployment to Netlify, as Chris was describing. So every time, let's say, I do some changes and commit my stuff to GitHub, there's an integration that takes the code from GitHub to Netlify, and then Netlify tries to deploy those latest changes to their servers. And during the build, there's a file that is being run called, well, designtokens.js. And what happens inside of this file is that we send a request to Figma API, which is an API that allows us to get some data about our designs from Figma. And as Figma is a cloud-based app, basically all the designs you do in Figma, they're always up to date. So yeah, you send a request, you get some JSON in a response. So yeah, then what's the next step? It looks kind of like that. That's the response from the Figma API. And it's basically like the representation of your design file. And there's a lot of clutter in it, a lot of stuff you completely don't need. So we ran this through a few custom functions. And eventually, we write our result into designtokens.json file. And those are our actual design tokens. So what you can find in this file is, yeah, a small set of data. And those are the tokens. So there are, let's say, colors and spacing values here. And every token is a combination of two. There's a key and there's a value. So let's say there's a color light and there's a value in RGB. Or there's some spacing and there's a value equal 5. By the way, notice that this value is unitless. This will be quite important later on. And what happens to those tokens? In our case, yeah, we just have a single HTML page. So what I do is I use a templating engine called Nunjax to rudely insert those data directly in my CSS. So yeah, this is just a plain CSS file with Nunjax on top of this, and I take this data and put it directly in some CSS custom properties to be used for theming and spacing. Of course, that's not the ideal approach for many cases, but this way we're avoiding any additional steps. Usually, we would first translate those tokens into, let's say, SAS variables or variables specific for other environment or platform. And yeah, in this case, we are writing our design tokens using Figma API directly from designs, but we don't have to do it. We can also just type it ourselves, just copy and paste them from Avocode, Zeppelin, or whatever else. We can just grab it from the design tool. We can also use other integrations, let's say with Sketch or Adobe XD. It will also work very well. Cool. So let's get back to our definition now. Definition that says that design tokens are an agnostic way to store variables so that your design system can be shared across platforms. Okay, so now you may ask, like, so where's your design system? And where are your platforms? Where's your personal Android app? So no, there's no Android app and there's no design system, in fact. And that's because the design tokens, it's not a strict methodology. It's not some set of rules that you need to implement to say confidently that, yes, I use design tokens. And some time ago, I was listening to a very nice interview. By the way, conducted by Vitaly Friedman, who is just talking in the room downstairs, with Brad Frost, the creator of Atomic Design. And they were talking about design systems and when do people need design systems. And actually, when we ask when do we need design tokens, it's a very similar question to when do we need design system, in a way. And Brad asked, like, when do people should use design systems? Answer that, well, to some extent, every website can benefit from component-driven architecture applied to design and development principles. So in other words, like even the smallest project in some way can benefit from design systems as a kind of approach, as a way of thinking. And we can paraphrase this sentence and say that every project can benefit from system-driven architecture applied to design and development principles. And what I mean here by a system is usually a combination of at least 3 things. Tokens, like the smallest reusable parts of your system, then the components, like the functional bits that use those tokens, and eventually the principles that define how those components should be used. Yeah, so design tokens are not a strict methodology. It's more about the way you approach your designs. It's more about the way you approach your code than about creating style guides, design systems, complex documentations, etc. All right, so what are the main characteristics of design tokens after all? First of all, as we said, design tokens tend to be platform agnostic. And in practice, this usually means 2 things. First thing, that, yeah, it's good to store them in a format that is platform agnostic. So in a format that we can later translate easily into different platforms. Good are, let's say, JSON or YAML. But also it means that those tokens should be stored in a way that is easily translated into different units for different platforms. So let's say we rather don't use like Ms, rams, and even pixels for design tokens. It's much more convenient to think about design tokens in terms of like spacing and sizing, like ratios. So we just keep unitless numbers and then we translate them into different units. Another thing, yeah, single value multi-purpose. So design tokens always have one value. There's a key and there's a value. So color red, sizing big, that's it. That's a single token, but multi-purpose. So we use design tokens for stuff that is used multiple times in a project. If something is used only once, there's a very unique value. It probably doesn't have to be a token after all. Mutable. Yeah, so we create design tokens to be able to change them. Like, there's no that much of use of design tokens if we're not able to modify them later. So yes, we create design tokens so they can be dynamic. And let's say we can swap one color with another, or we can reduce the spacing, or make our layout different. That's one of the main benefits of design tokens. And eventually, design related. Might sound obvious, but is usually not that much. So yeah, we use design tokens for stuff that is actually related to design. So rather not copy changes or API keys and environmental variables, more stuff like, yeah, what are those design tokens? So first of all the things that you define in your design tool, so spacing, sizing, typography, colors, those are all like the most popular design tokens. But there are also much less tangible stuff that we still use as design tokens, such as animations or z-indexes or even media queries. Yeah, okay, so the main benefits of using design tokens, what are they? First of all, maintainability and scalability. So using design tokens, it's usually much easier to scale your project and to just keep the quality level and make it more maintainable, as we have limited set of choices and it's just easier to organize it in a way. And that all boils down eventually to quality and consistency. And it's both about designs and about your code. It's about the consistency between designs and designs. It's about consistency between designs and code. It's about consistency between different platforms and about different code bases. With design tokens, we have a single source of truth. And as silly as it sounds, as the project grows, it may actually help a lot. Flexibility. Yeah, so as I said, we create design tokens so they can be dynamic. And let's say if you want to create like a light mode and a dark mode, usually it's much easier if you have design tokens in place because you don't really have to mess with your CSS or styling or whatever. You just swap one set of tokens with another set of tokens and you're done. So this actually helps a lot with any tools that allow some customization of your UI. And eventually educational value. So yeah, it's impossible to work with design tokens as a designer if you don't understand the basics of how they are being used. And it's impossible to work with design tokens as a developer if you don't understand the basics of design. And yeah, this is definitely kind of a challenge, but I would consider it a huge benefit because it brings the team much more together. And speaking of challenges, there are a few common challenges that teams experience when working with design tokens. And those are, first of all, keeping the tokens up to date and actually useful. As we've seen in the example before, we can use some kind of integrations for that. We can do it manually, but it's always a challenge to decide when, what, and how it should be updated. And eventually also rendering differences and this kind of stuff. So we don't live in an ideal world just yet. And for design tokens, it means that you can put all your sizings and spacings and dimensions in design tokens, but it won't save you. It won't save you from some single pixels floating somewhere in your code and for little tweaks that we will have to make here and there. Because you cannot just predict everything that will happen. And there are some differences between browsers, between environments. There are differences in terms of how line height and letter spacing is interpreted in different platforms. So yeah, design tokens will help a lot, but they won't save you from all manual work. Categorization and naming conventions. That's always a challenge, same as with a design system. You never know how to properly name and categorize stuff, and that's the same with tokens. My favorite situation is when I have tokens like heading light, and I never know, is it a heading light, not a heading bold, or is it a heading light, not a heading dark? And it's an unsolved mystery. Ownership and contribution. So yeah, somebody eventually needs to own this thing and needs to be responsible for the tokens. It's quite a lot of work, so it won't happen by itself. And it's also very important to tell people and explain them how they can actually contribute to the library. And so everybody can feel a part of it and everybody can be an author. No, it's not just owned by one person who tells the rest what they should do. And design tokens, the best practices. So yeah, first thing, don't turn everything into a token. Yeah, don't use things that are not necessarily reusable as tokens, but also don't worry about getting all in if you decide to use this kind of approach in your project. You really don't have to start that big. You can, let's say, start with some easy stuff and turn a few colors or typography variables into tokens, and then continue with a bit more complex stuff later. And don't build in isolation. And that's exactly the same as with building your components. So yeah, I've met quite a few teams that started with building components that are later being used for do some UI. And it's usually not the best approach because it's really hard to build components and tokens without context. Usually, it turns out much better if you build your tokens library, if you build your components library and your design system as you use it and as your project grows. So as you have the full context and how exactly the stuff you create will be used. So yeah, don't build a huge, robust library tokens before you even start working on the project. More the other way around. As you work on the project, keep adding stuff to the library. And don't confuse options with decisions. This is kind of connected with naming conventions and with categorization. So those are two separate things. If you think about colors, you can have a specific hue of orange, a specific hue of green, a specific hue of red, and so on, and that's the color palette of your project. But then you make some design decisions about how those colors will be used. So this is an error color, and this is a success color. And usually both of those things are needed, and you will find them in your project, but the thing is not to confuse them with one another. And don't put a red color and a success color on the same palette. First define your palette, first define your options, and then decide which of the options are used for what design decisions. This will help you a lot. And also it will help you a lot with specifying the right usage of the tokens. I mean, it's really hard to remember why you created a certain token or component yourself after a few weeks, and it's even harder if it's not your token. So it's really, really important to document everything you do on the way. Just so those tokens are actually properly used. Because once you start using tokens without fully understanding their meaning and purpose, they stop to be useful. Because later somebody will change the token from light to darker or whatever, thinking that this is just a border, and suddenly some text disappears in another part of the project. So yeah, it's really, really crucial to be very specific about how each token should be used. And structure your designs properly. Yeah, so when you work with a design system of any kind, you probably notice that it's much easier if your design system in the design tool kind of matches with how it's been implemented. So on a very basic level, let's say that you have some component named button primary, and then you have a component or a symbol in Sketch, Figma, whatever, that is named the same and hides the similar structure inside. So it's kind of easy to figure out what's exactly what and what represents which part of the component. And this is the same with the tokens. If you have a design tokens library, it's very, very convenient to use them the same way in your design tool and in your code. So in design tools, we can, for example, use styles for this. And if you use those styles using the same naming and like the same context, then it's just much easier to keep everything in sync, because you can update a certain style and then update a certain token of the same name, and you're like certain that it will result in the same change on both sides. If you keep like all your colors in a design just floating around as some random hex and RGB codes, this may cause you a lot of trouble, because you never actually know in how many places have you used it and what exactly should be updated. Cool, so summing up, design tokens are an agnostic way of managing your design decisions. And it's a practice that actually can all projects benefit from. And yeah, it's a very useful thing for design systems, especially big ones, but it can also be used independently. And it's nice to think about design tokens as a kind of a bridge between design and development that first promotes shared knowledge and supports consistency and maintainability, but also just helps everybody work together and understand each other better. All right, so that's all what I wanted to share with you today. At the end of the slides, if you later find my slides or Twitter or somewhere, you will find all the crucial references from the talk. And apart from that, I will be happy to answer any of your questions. And thank you.